I really like looking at the reality of the situation. Who, in effect, pays the corporate income tax? When corporations view the tax as a cost, just like in my business I view resin prices as a cost, who, in effect, pays that corporate tax?
The shareholders, in my view.
You don't think it's the consumers of the product?
Absolutely not.
Mr. Hodge, what would you say?
I can prove that to you if you want. There's many, many companies in this country that argue for replacing the corporate income tax with the tax on consumers. It seemed to me a waste of time if it was already a tax on consumers, so I can't understand why they would make the effort.
I mean, overall, the U.S. economy has never really generated much more than about 18.8% of GDP in terms of revenue. And Professor Hauser calls that Hauser's Law. I'd like you to speak to that basic fact. I mean, as much as we would like to believe we could raise 21% of GDP in revenue by a different tax regimen, how realistic is that to actually occur?
Well, we've done it before. In fact, the only times we've ever balanced the budget in the last 50 years are when we did it. So
in the 2012 budget, President Obama's budget, there's only 3 years where we actually collected revenue greater than 20% of GDP.
Right. I'm saying the last time we
times.
balanced the budget was in the Clinton administration when revenues went up to almost 21% of the GDP. And back in the 60s, we balanced the budget briefly when it was about 20% of the GDP. All the other years in between those balanced budgets in Clinton and Johnson, different Johnson, were places where we had lower revenues and unbalanced budgets.
But don't you acknowledge the fact that taxpayers simply can't reorganize their affairs quickly enough when you increase tax rates? It just takes a little while. You are able to snare a higher percentage of GDP when you increase taxes, but eventually that benefit falls off.
No, I don't think that's true. And I think what happened, and it's very clear what happened to the corporate income tax, is that members of Congress are either cajoled or threatened by the corporate lobbyists to give them back their loopholes. And then every once in a while, we have to clean up the tax code again. It used to be on a 15-year cycle. We missed out on the 2001 one due to a difficult election decision. But we are overdue to clean it up again. And yeah, it's kind of like the Medicare rules with the doctors. If you don't change them often enough, they'll understand them.
Well, first, oftentimes when I listen to these discussions, it's like we have an option not to compete. I mean, the U.S. as a country has to compete for global capital, correct? We don't have that option. We have to compete. So how do we compete when the CEO from Intel says in his decision-making factor, in order to produce or build a semiconductor plant, it costs $4 billion in Asia and $5 billion in the U.S. And he largely attributes that to tax regimen. I'm sure regulations play a part in that. If you're a corporate manager, let's say from a different country, if you're looking at investment decisions, why would you spend an extra $1 billion to invest in the U.S.?
Well, there's no doubt that some companies have advantages in low wages or that they provide other benefits that make it cheaper to do things abroad, and there's not too much we can do about that. My point is that we probably shouldn't be paying our companies to go there. So if there's a tax advantage in China, I'll take your word for it. We could solve that problem by getting rid of deferral so that the Chinese profits would be taxed at the same rate as if those profits were earned in the United States. So, yes, if that's a problem, my solution solves it.
Mr. Hodge.
The corporate tax rate in China is 25%, which is just slightly below the average of the major industrialized countries. It's 15 percentage points lower than the federal corporate tax rate. So by definition, it is a much more competitive place, a cheaper, at least from a tax perspective, place to do business. And by ending deferral, as Bob has suggested, you would instantly make U.S. companies less competitive while doing business there and give a distinct advantage to German firms, Swiss firms, French firms, every other firms that are doing business there. We want U.S. companies to do business in China. We want them to succeed in the global marketplace. And by hamstringing them, by eliminating deferral, or keeping the U.S. tax rate where it is, we are making the U.S. less competitive, we're making U.S. companies less competitive, and ultimately we're making U.S. workers less competitive. And that is a recipe for slow economic growth.